Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Today's subject is the Roman emperor known as Caligula. Wild, cruel, and unpredictable, history has branded Caligula as a madman. But was he born a monster, or did Rome make him one? We'll talk about his life, and then reveal what the emperor, who may have been the inspiration for King Joffrey in Game of Thrones, really looked like. So let's go ahead and get started. Gaius Caesar Germanicus, later known as Caligula, was born on August 31st, 12 AD. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Rome's first emperor Augustus. His father, Germanicus, was the grandson of Mark Antony, making Caligula a descendant of two of Rome's most powerful men. Caligula's father, Germanicus, was described as a kind, brave, and intelligent man who was incredibly popular not only with his troops, but with the Roman people. As a child, Gaius wanted to be just like his father, and even accompanied Germanicus on military campaigns dressed up in a miniature armor made by his mother. It was here that he earned the affectionate nickname Caligula, meaning little boot. When Emperor Augustus died in 14 AD, Germanicus' men even mutinied, wanting him to claim the throne for himself. But he refused. He swore loyalty to the new emperor, his uncle Tiberius, a decision he would later come to regret. Tiberius is, in many ways, a tragic figure. By the time he became emperor, he was 55, and he had made it clear over and over again that he never wanted the throne. In fact, he was never supposed to get it. During the course of his life, Tiberius had 5 men ahead of him in the succession, including his own younger brother, Drusus. All 5 men ended up dying early deaths. During his time as heir, Tiberius suffered. He was forced to divorce his wife, who was pregnant with his first child, which led to a disastrous marriage to Augustus's daughter Julia, who repeatedly had affairs with his political rivals, leaving him humiliated and depressed. He would retire from politics at the age of only 36, only to be made to return by Augustus. By the time he became emperor, his dream of a much quieter life had slipped away, and an anger buried deep in his soul began to bubble to the surface. As part of becoming Augustus's heir, Tiberius was forced to adopt Caligula's father, Germanicus, as his son. But because Tiberius already had a son of his own, Drusus the Younger, he decided to name them both his heirs. He had hoped, since they were the same age and had progressed through the ranks at the same pace, they would become close and could rule the empire together. But as the years went by, it became clear to Tiberius that although Drusus was well liked by the people, Germanicus was loved by them. Just like he had been, his son was becoming an afterthought. Even as emperor, what Tiberius wanted was being ignored. In 1980, when Caligula was only 7, he would learn his first painful lesson. Being loved in Rome was not always a good thing. While traveling with his family, Germanicus fell violently ill, and within days, he was dead at just 34 years old, leaving many suspicious of his untimely death. Caligula's mother, Agrippina, was convinced that her husband had been murdered, eliminated so that Tiberius's own son, Drusus, could rule alone and prosper without being under Germanicus' shadow. From this moment on, Caligula's family became enemies of the emperor. Although Tiberius would attempt to silence her, Agrippina spoke out publicly, demanding her sons take their father's place as rightful heirs. It seemed like their rivalry would continue for years, but in 23 AD, a single event would change the course of all of their lives. On September 14th, 23, Drusus the Younger, Tiberius' only son and heir, was found dead. The loss of his son was a devastating blow to Tiberius, and he cursed the cruel life that becoming emperor had given him. He soon sank completely into despair, and by 26 AD, he left Rome to basically run itself. In his absence, Tiberius's most trusted friend and advisor, Sejanus, would take advantage of the power vacuum and become the emperor's voice in Rome. Cunning and ruthless, Sejanus would begin a purge of Rome's most influential families. One of the first to fall was Caligula's family. Shielded by his youth, Caligula was not targeted, but Agrippina and her two eldest sons were dragged through sham trials and exiled. Within a year, Caligula's brother Nero was dead. But just as he had risen, Sejanus would fall, when it was revealed in a letter that it had been Sejanus who had murdered Drusus, secretly poisoning him. When Tiberius realized that his most trusted friend had murdered his only son, the betrayal shattered what little sanity Tiberius had left. Sejanus and his wife Livilla were swiftly executed, and that only marked the beginning. Seeing the emperor's outrage firsthand, along with the fact that he would never see his mother and brothers again, made Caligula, who was now 19, realize that he only had two options: become a victim or find a way to survive. In 31 AD, Caligula and his sisters were forced to move in with the emperor at his new home in Capri. Now under the watchful eye of the paranoid and permanently damaged Tiberius, Caligula had to destroy who he had been before now and become someone completely different. Villa Jovis was a marvel of Roman engineering. 75,000 square feet, 13 stories high, and completely secluded. This prison of grandeur would be where Caligula became new. He would become friends with Naevius Macro, Tiberius' new second in command, and with his help, learn to present himself as friendly, intelligent, and obedient. But most importantly, Caligula seemed to genuinely care for Tiberius' grandson, Gemellus, who was only 12 years old. Even when he was told of his own mother and elder brother's death in 33, Caligula did not seem to care. But this apathy was a smokescreen. Any protest would have likely cost him his life. Knowing this, Caligula continued to disguise his true self and learned to smile through the pain. Eventually, the act seemed to have worked on Emperor Tiberius. In 35 AD, Tiberius named Caligula as joint heir with his grandson Gemellus. Against all odds, Caligula, unlike many members of his own family, had survived the emperor's wrath and was now so close to fulfilling his father's destiny. Everything would fall perfectly into place for Caligula when, on March 16, 37 AD, Tiberius died suddenly at the age of 77. With Macro pulling the strings, Caligula entered Rome and was hailed as emperor. The Roman consuls agreed to nullify Tiberius' will and grant Caligula full authority, dismissing Gemellus outright. Now initially, it seemed like Caligula's reign was going to be promising. He was charismatic, intelligent, and young, the polar opposite of Tiberius. He gained popularity by reversing Tiberius' oppressive policies, hosting extravagant public games, initiating impressive construction projects, and generously gifting the citizens of Rome money to usher in a new golden age. But in October of the year 37, Caligula fell seriously ill. Historians don't know what he got sick with, but it was said that for over a month, the young emperor was stuck in a fevered delirium, and no one truly knew if he would live or die. When Caligula finally did recover in late November, something had changed. It may have been his close call with death, or the idea that, like his father, he had been poisoned. But it's after this illness that Caligula begins to earn his reputation in history. His first order after his recovery was the arrest of his supposed co-heir Gemellus for praying for his downfall. But along with Gemellus, Caligula wanted his closest advisor, Macro, arrested as well. Tiberius' reign had taught him that those closest to you were often the ones plotting against you, and he was not going to make the same mistakes as he did. Both men were executed in early 38. His cold betrayal of Macro, who had been a major reason why Caligula was even emperor in the first place, had shocked the Roman Senate, and many of them now looked at Caligula with disgust. But not only would Caligula not apologize for these actions, he doubled down. He accused all of them of being hypocrites, They all craved the power that he had. It was the Senate that had rotted Rome from the inside out. The Senate, through all of their high-minded ideals, had been the ones who killed Caesar in cold blood, and then praised him as a god, but only after his death. They had loved his father, Germanicus, yet did nothing after his assassination. Caligula declared to them that he no longer cared if they pretended to love him. He knew that they hated him and wanted him dead. So, he would make them fear him instead. He began holding treason trials and looked into every record that was available to him as emperor. If anyone had given information that led to the downfall of Caligula's family, they were swiftly executed. Anyone who had been acquitted by Tiberius now had to be also forgiven by Caligula. Historian Dio even claims that at one point, Caligula began to just pick senators at random and would strip these men of all their titles, honors, property, and money. For others that were considered his friends, he would simply ask for their wives to be given to him, and then openly discuss how much he liked or disliked the affair. This humiliation of the Senate would continue for the rest of Caligula's life, and it got to the point where anything could set him off. According to one legend, in 39, Caligula furiously dismissed 2 consuls because they had not celebrated his birthday extravagantly enough. And after ordering one of them to commit suicide, proposed that his favorite horse, Incitatus, should take his place as consul. While many historians naturally question this story, it speaks to the truth of Caligula's dark humor as emperor. For any ordinary man, this would just be a joke. But for Caligula, his every whim was obeyed, creating a dangerous, cruel, and malicious environment. But it was this same disrespect of the Roman elite that made the lower classes of Rome adore him. They saw Caligula as one of them. He loved all the same things as them, like gambling, the theater, and chariot racing, even participating in the games as a gladiator or chariot rider himself. By this point, Caligula realized that he could do whatever he wanted. No one was brave enough to tell him no matter how crazy or expensive the idea was. He ordered the building of pleasure boats 300 feet long, amphitheaters larger than anyone had ever seen, and once even ordered a 3-mile bridge be built in the Bay of Naples, all because he wanted to ride his favorite horse across it wearing the armor of Alexander the Great. In the span of only 1 or 2 years, Caligula is thought to have spent the equivalent of $70 billion. When he realized that he was starting to run low on funds, he began to make up fake charges of treason, confiscating everything from some of Rome's wealthiest families, then personally auctioning it off to the highest bidder. There are dozens of horrible stories about Caligula to tell. However, all of them were written decades or even centuries after his death. I'm sure there's a grain of truth to them, but it's very clear that the Roman elite hated Caligula, and he hated them back. So, of course, after his death, they wrote countless stories that made him out to be insane. So while the truth of each anecdote is not really known, they all paint a bigger picture. Caligula was a man-child, whose cruel sense of humor was taken literally and obeyed. His every whim was entertained, and his temper allowed him to turn into a monster. But in the end, it wasn't the treatment of his enemies that ultimately caused his downfall. It was his bullying of a single man that was sworn to protect him. Cassius Correa, one of Caligula's personal bodyguards, was by all accounts a distinguished, brave, and loyal man who had served Caligula's father, Germanicus. In order to become one of the emperor's bodyguards, you had to be one of the strongest and most skilled soldiers in Rome, capable of protecting the emperor from any threat. Cassius checked all of those boxes. His only perceived fault was his extremely high, feminine voice, something that Caligula constantly berated and insulted Cassius for, calling him Venus after the goddess of beauty and aiming crude jokes at him. This mockery apparently continued on so often and so long that Cassius's hatred towards Caligula became unbearable to withstand. On January 24th, 41 AD, Caligula was attending a play, when all of a sudden Cassius grabbed him and stabbed him repeatedly. The little room offered a little chance of escape, and before anyone was able to come to the emperor's aid, he was dead. Although Cassius had hoped that Caligula's death would inspire the Senate to abolish the office of emperor and restore the Republic, most citizens were taken aback by Caligula's murder and couldn't see why they would want to restore power to the Senate, whom they still had mistrust in. When Caligula's uncle Claudius was found trembling behind a curtain, any resistance was all but over, and he was hailed as the next emperor of Rome. Cassius, the only man who had been brave enough to end Caligula's reign, was tried and executed by the same senators who secretly celebrated Caligula's fall. Caligula's reign stands as history's greatest warning that absolute power creates monsters. Yet we must remember that before he terrorized Rome, Rome had terrorized him. Was his brutality the reign of a madman, or the vengeance of a broken man striking back at the elite who had betrayed him? So let's talk about what Caligula really looked like. We have a few contemporary images of Caligula, but not as many statues or coins as you might expect. Many were destroyed after his tyrannical reign, thrown into the Tiber River or recarved as the faces of his successors. Caligula's statues fall within the Julio-Claudian artistic tradition, combining Greek idealism with Roman realism. Their main goal was to stylistically associate Caligula, a weak emperor, with the stronger emperors of his past, like his great-grandfather Augustus. Even though we can see markers of his cruelty, a frown on his pursed lips, for example, we also see the same full head of hair, strong shoulders, symmetrical features, and large, steady eyes as his predecessors. However, there are different versions of his statues which are less flattering. The National Museum of Rome statue head, for example, shows a strongly asymmetrical jaw and less pleasing features. On the other end of the spectrum is the Metropolitan Museum, the most flattering and most handsome. And then we have some that are kind of in between. But all of these are hiding the truth, that according to Suetonius, Caligula was described as having an ill-proportioned large head and a skinny neck, with sunken eyes and sunken temples, and a receding hairline with baldness on the back of his head. He apparently practiced menacing expressions in the mirror, trying to evoke fear in his subjects. According to statues where pigments could still be found, Caligula had medium to light brown hair, tan skin, and brown or hazel eyes. It was reported that Caligula slept very badly, only about 3 hours a night, and was constantly disturbed by paranoia. So I imagine him looking quite weathered and older than his years. I've used this contemporary bust of Caligula for my recreation, so let's take a look at his face now.